March 1864. The gray lands of Cold Creek, straddling the border between Kentucky and Tennessee, were soaked with rain and the blood of 3 long years of war. The wind howled across the abandoned fields, carrying the acrid scent of gunpowder and burned-out hopes. The earth, scarred by artillery, seemed no longer able to bear fruit, only memories and graves. That cold, damp morning, a small group of ragged soldiers marched in silence. Their faded blue uniforms barely masked the exhaustion hollowing their eyes and wearing down their battered boots. They were not the heroes written about in the newspapers of New York. They were men forgotten by luck, by honor, even by history itself. And leading them, rifle slung over his shoulder, marched Samuel Carter. Captain Carter, only 28 years old, was not carved from marble like the generals up in high command. He bore calloused hands, burn marks on his arms, and a fierce stubbornness in his storm-gray eyes. The son of inland farmers, he knew that war was not made of speeches. It was made of mud, gunpowder, and broken bones. And yet, within him burned something few could see: faith. The orders given the night before had been clear: defend Cold Creek at all costs. There would be no reinforcements, no recognition. If they held, they would be forgotten. If they fell, they would be buried as numbers in a cold column of losses. Samuel knew they had been sent to die. But when he looked at his men, he saw more than broken souls. He saw fire. Among them were Irishmen, freedmen, landless farmers, nameless boys, men the Union itself had cast to the bottom of the line for glory. And yet, here they were, marching to defend a bridge, a mill, and a village deemed insignificant by their own generals. But to Samuel, Cold Creek was not just a coordinate. It was the symbol of something far greater. When they reached the hill overlooking the valley, Samuel unslung his rifle, planted his boots in the mud, and scanned the horizon. Beyond the gray mist, Confederate flags rippled in the wind. His stomach turned, not from fear, but from fury. "Cold Creek will not fall while we still draw breath," he murmured, and on that forgotten ground, the first spark was lit. The valley below Cold Creek was a swamp of broken fences, dead trees, and fields scarred by cannon fire. Mist clung low to the ground, coiling around the ruins like a ghost refusing to leave. Captain Samuel Carter stood at the crest of the hill, his boots sinking into the wet earth, surveying the crumbling town that had now become their last line of defense. Around him, his men moved in silence, their faces gaunt and pale in the morning gloom. Shovels clanged against frozen dirt as they dug trenches with trembling hands. There were no cheers, no songs, no speeches about glory. Only the heavy breathing of exhausted men trying to carve survival from the mud. Every strike of the shovel was a prayer whispered into the ground. Private Isaac Reed, barely 19, limped past Carter with a makeshift bandage tied around his thigh. He gave a crooked smile and a nod. "Ain't no generals coming to save us, sir," he muttered. Carter returned the nod without a word. In Cold Creek, there would be no medals, no parades, only men left to stand against a tide that cared nothing for their names or faces. As the morning dragged on, a bitter rain began to fall, soaking their uniforms and turning the trenches into shallow rivers of mud. Some men cursed, others simply bowed their heads and kept digging. Carter moved among them, placing a hand on a shoulder here, exchanging a glance there, weaving a silent net of resolve. They would hold. They must. Near the shattered old church that overlooked the river, Carter found a tattered Confederate banner half buried in the mud. He picked it up slowly, feeling the wet fabric in his hands. Without hesitation, he tied it to a crooked wooden post facing the road, a warning to whoever dared come. Cold Creek would not yield quietly. As Carter hammered the post into the ground, the sound of distant drums echoed through the valley. Slow, heavy, deliberate. Every head lifted. In the far mist, Dark figures began to form, like shadows born from the earth itself. The Confederates were coming, and they were bringing hell with them. The drums grew louder with every breath. Cold Creek's defenders crouched low behind hastily built barricades of broken wagons and dirt mounds. Samuel Carter adjusted his grip on the worn rifle, his heart pounding against his ribs. In the distance, the Confederates emerged, a long gray line stretching across the fields, rifles gleaming under the cold, bruised sky. For a heartbeat, everything froze. Carter could hear the wet squelch of boots shifting in mud, the shallow breathing of men around him, the caw of a lone crow overhead. Then a single gunshot cracked the air. A Confederate soldier stumbled forward, crumpling into the dirt. Cold Creek had spoken first. And with that, hell ripped itself open across the valley. Musket fire erupted from both sides, a thunderous roar that shook the ground. Smoke rolled over the battlefield, thick and choking. Carter shouted commands over the din, but the words barely reached the men nearest to him. Isaac Reed, rifle shaking in his hands, took aim and fired again, disappearing behind a cloud of sulfurous smoke. Bullets hissed past Carter's ears, tearing into wood and flesh alike. Men cried out, some falling into the mud without a sound. Still, the line held. They fired in ragged volleys, reloading with trembling fingers, faces set in grim determination. Carter moved among them, his voice hoarse, lifting fallen rifles into bloody hands, refusing to let the line break. Across the field, the Confederate officers barked orders, driving their men forward like cattle into a slaughterhouse. Cannon blasts tore gaping wounds into the earth, raining mud and fire. Carter felt the ground tremble beneath his boots, but planted himself firm like a tree in a hurricane. Cold Creek would not fall without carving its name into history. A sudden savage yell pierced through the smoke. A Confederate charge. Bayonets glittered like fangs in the fog. Carter tightened his grip on his rifle and took one step forward, meeting the oncoming tide head-on. There would be no retreat, only blood, iron, and the echo of freedom. The Confederate line surged forward with a howl, bayonets gleaming, boots pounding through the mud. Carter braced his feet and leveled his rifle, squeezing the trigger. The shot tore into a charging figure who crumpled mid-stride. Around him, his men rose from the trenches like ghosts from the grave, meeting the enemy with steel, fists, and raw defiance. The clash was thunder without sound, a brutal dance of blade against blade, boot against boot. Carter slammed the butt of his rifle into a soldier's ribs, feeling the crack of bone beneath the wood. A bayonet flashed toward him. He ducked, drove his shoulder into the attacker, and brought him down hard into the mud, fighting like a man who had already died 100 deaths. Screams and grunts filled the air, mingling with the roar of musket fire and cannon blasts in the distance. Isaac Reed fought nearby, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead, but he held his ground. Men who had been farmers, blacksmiths, and runaway slaves stood side by side, forging their names in the crucible of Cold Creek with blood and grit. The earth became a battlefield and a graveyard at once. Every inch gained was paid with broken bodies. The mud, already thick and heavy, became slick with blood, sucking at boots, pulling men down. Carter's arms ached, his breath came ragged, but he fought on, driving back the enemy inch by inch with the sheer force of will. Somewhere in the chaos, Carter caught sight of the Confederate officer, a tall man with a saber gleaming in hand, rallying his troops with cruel efficiency. Carter's vision tunneled. He knew if that man wasn't stopped, Cold Creek would fall. Gritting his teeth, Carter pushed through the melee, each step a battle, each heartbeat a thunderclap. Steel flashed toward Carter's face. A bayonet. He twisted at the last second, the blade grazing his cheek. Gritting blood between his teeth, he lunged forward, tackling the Confederate officer to the mud. The two men struggled, locked in a fight neither could afford to lose. Cold Creek's fate hung in the balance. Mud splashed as Carter and the Confederate officer wrestled, grunting and clawing for control. The officer's saber gleamed wickedly, slashing the air inches from Carter's throat. Carter grabbed the man's wrist, forcing the blade aside. Their boots slid in the blood-soaked ground as they struggled like wild beasts under the shattered sky, rage and survival driving every move. The officer, larger and better fed, shoved Carter back into the mud. Stars exploded in Carter's vision, but instinct roared louder than pain. He twisted, grabbing a handful of the enemy's uniform, dragging him down. Their fists became hammers, striking without mercy. Around them, the battle raged. But in this moment, the world narrowed to one life against another. With a snarl, the officer drove his knee into Carter's ribs. Air whooshed from Carter's lungs. The saber came down again. Carter caught the blade with his bare hands, feeling the edge tear his palms. With a guttural roar, he wrenched the weapon free and drove his shoulder into the man's chest, slamming him backward into a broken wagon wheel. Gasping for breath, Carter rose from the mud, saber clenched in his bleeding fists. The officer staggered to his feet, blood running from his mouth, his own pistol trembling in hand. Time slowed. Carter saw not an enemy, but a man, broken, desperate, just like him. Yet only one would walk away from this cursed valley. Only one would keep Cold Creek standing. The officer raised his pistol. Carter moved faster. With a final surge of fury, he lunged forward, driving the saber through the man's chest. The pistol fired wildly into the sky as the Confederate officer gasped, then fell to his knees, the light already fading from his eyes. Carter yanked the blade free, chest heaving, hands slick with blood. Victory was bitter on Carter's tongue. Around him, the battle still raged, new waves of Confederates crashing into their lines. He raised the saber high and shouted a ragged cry into the smoke-choked air. Cold Creek would not fall today, but Carter knew the real storm was only just beginning. The ground shuddered under a new storm of cannon fire. Trees splintered and flew like shrapnel through the thick, smoke-choked air. Carter stumbled back toward the battered lines, his chest heaving, blood from a dozen cuts streaking his uniform. The Confederates had fallen back only to return stronger, hammering Cold Creek like a relentless tide. Rain poured in sheets, turning the trenches into rivers of filth. Mud clung to the men's boots like chains, dragging them down. Musket barrels jammed with wet powder. Men resorted to clubs and bayonets. Carter shouted over the chaos, rallying what strength they had left. The enemy pressed closer with each breath, and the world shrank to blood, smoke, and rain. Private Isaac Reed fired blindly into the fog, his face grimy and bloodied. Nearby, Sergeant Micah Ward, once a blacksmith, now a warrior of necessity, swung a rusted saber with brutal efficiency. These men, discarded and forgotten by the world, stood shoulder to shoulder, their backs to the town they refused to surrender. Thunder cracked above, a roar so loud it seemed to shake the bones of the earth. Carter wiped rain and blood from his eyes, scanning the battlefield for any sign of weakness. He knew, if they broke here, it would be the end. No reinforcements would come, no trumpets would sound their retreat. Cold Creek would be buried under Confederate boots and forgotten forever. The enemy came closer, their battle cries merging with the thunder. Carter lifted his rifle, soaked, battered, determined. "We hold!" he bellowed into the storm, voice raw and defiant. "We hold Cold Creek, or we die standing!" A ragged cheer rose from the men, a defiant roar against the dying light. Through the smoke and rain, Carter saw it. A Confederate artillery crew setting up on the ridge. One blast from those cannons, and their defenses would crumble. Gritting his teeth, Carter made a decision. He would not wait to die. He would take the fight to them. The ridge loomed ahead, crowned by Confederate cannons already spitting smoke and flame. Carter gathered a handful of men, the strongest, the fastest, the most desperate. Rain plastered their hair to their foreheads, mud clung to their uniforms, but in their eyes blazed something fierce, the fire of men who had nothing left to lose. Without waiting for orders from above, Carter raised his saber and charged. The men surged forward behind him, boots slamming through the muck, rifles clutched like lifelines. Gunfire cracked around them, bullets slicing the air. Still they ran, teeth bared, hearts pounding against their ribs like war drums. One man fell, then another, their bodies lost to the mud and chaos. But Carter didn't stop. He led them up the hill, a human tidal wave crashing against fortified death. A cannon roared, hurling men into the air like rag dolls. But Carter ducked low, feeling the earth tremble, the air scream around him. At the ridge's crest, Carter slammed into the nearest gun crew, his rifle swinging like an axe. A Confederate soldier shouted in surprise before Carter silenced him with a savage blow. Around him, his men fought with bayonets, fists, anything they could hold. The high ground became a frenzy of screams, smoke, and clashing steel. Isaac Reed reached the nearest cannon, grappling with a gunner twice his size. Ward took a bayonet through the shoulder but kept fighting, dragging the assailant down with him. The fight wasn't fair. It wasn't glorious. It was savage and ugly and real, the kind of battle history books would never bother to write down. Carter seized a cannon's fuse, yanked it free, and swung it around like a torch. The artillery crews fell back, but new ranks of Confederates appeared over the far ridge. Blood dripped from Carter's fingers. His lungs burned. The guns were silenced for now, but Cold Creek's final trial had only just begun. Smoke curled in bitter plumes across the ridge. Carter wiped grime from his eyes, surveying what was left of his force. A ragged handful of men, bleeding, battered, but still breathing. The cannons were silenced, but it had cost them dearly. Cold Creek now rested on the broken backs of the few who refused to let it die. Down the slope, the Confederate ranks reformed, banners snapping in the wet wind. They came on with methodical, merciless precision, a machine of flesh and steel. Carter's hands trembled around his rifle, not from fear, but from exhaustion so deep it gnawed at his bones. He knew there would be no second charge, no second chance. "Form a line!" Carter barked, voice hoarse. The survivors staggered into place, shoulder to shoulder, mud and blood gluing them together. Private Reed, barely standing, raised his rifle with shaking arms. Sergeant Ward, pale and bleeding from the shoulder, locked eyes with Carter and gave a grim nod. They would not run. The enemy advanced slowly, cruelly confident. Bayonets gleamed in the mist, footsteps drumming in terrifying rhythm. Carter planted himself at the center, anchoring the line. The ground was soaked, the sky broken, the world reduced to a single breath, a single moment. If Cold Creek was to fall, it would fall in fire, not in silence. Carter raised his saber one last time. "Hold," he whispered through cracked lips. The first volleys erupted, muskets flashing bright against the gray. The enemy staggered, but did not break. Carter's men answered with a roar, unleashing their final fury into the storm. In the chaos, Carter caught a glimpse. Enemy cavalry moving in from the flanks. A trap. Their last stand was about to be swallowed whole. Gritting his teeth, Carter gripped his rifle tighter. They had vowed to hold Cold Creek, and they would hold it or die on its bloody threshold. The cavalry swept in like wolves, hooves churning the mud into a black sea. Carter shouted orders, but the line shattered under the impact. Men screamed, muskets fired blindly, steel clashed against steel. The world dissolved into chaos. Mud, blood, the crack of bones, the desperate gasp for one more breath. Carter fought like a cornered animal, rifle swinging, fists hammering, teeth clenched against the pain. He saw Reed fall, a saber slicing across the boy's chest. Ward disappeared into a knot of enemy riders, his saber flashing desperately. The ground became a butcher's yard, cold, wet, and unforgiving. Mud swallowed boots and bodies alike. The wounded cried out, only to be silenced by bayonets and boots. Carter stumbled, blood blinding one eye, But he kept fighting, driven by fury, by duty, by the ghost of every man who had trusted him to lead. Each swing of his weapon carved another heartbeat from death. Through the storm of violence, Carter spotted the enemy standard, a Confederate officer rallying the charge. With a roar, Carter forced his broken body forward, slamming into the officer with all the strength he had left. The two fell into the muck, wrestling, biting, clawing like beasts stripped of all humanity. Carter ripped the pistol from the officer's belt and fired point blank. The man jerked, then went still, sinking into the mud. Around him, the fight thinned. The Confederates, sensing their losses, began to pull back. But the cost was written in crimson on the shattered ground. Victory smelled like blood and smoke. Gasping for air, Carter dropped to one knee. The valley was silent now, broken only by the groans of the dying. Rain hammered the ruins of Cold Creek. They had held. But as Carter looked across the field of the fallen, he wondered if victory could ever be worth such a terrible price. Morning crept over Cold Creek like a pale, broken ghost. The rain had stopped, but the battlefield lay drowned in mud and sorrow. Carter stood alone among the ruins, his body aching, his soul hollow. Around him, the dead lay silent, friend and foe alike, stitched into the earth they had bled to defend. He found Isaac Reed near the trenches, the young private's rifle still clutched in stiff, lifeless hands. He found Ward farther up the slope, his face turned skyward, a quiet defiance frozen in death. Carter knelt beside each fallen brother, whispering their names into the heavy morning air, promising they would not be forgotten. There were no banners raised, no cheers of victory, only the whisper of the wind through the shattered trees and the distant rumble of a war still raging elsewhere. Cold Creek would not appear in history books. No medals would be pinned. But Carter knew what they had done here mattered, if only to the soil beneath their feet. Pain gripped his chest as he planted a broken rifle into the ground atop the ridge. He tied a scrap of blue fabric to it, a crude, tattered flag, and saluted in silence. This would be their marker, their monument. Not marble, not gold, but something more enduring. Memory etched into earth and blood. With heavy steps, Carter turned from the ridge. There were still wars to fight, still chains to break, still a nation to rebuild from its own ashes. He carried no sword, no glory, only the weight of the fallen and the fire they had lit within him, a fire that no storm could ever extinguish. As he walked into the dawn, the broken fields of Cold Creek stretched out behind him, silent witnesses to a forgotten stand. History would lose their names. Time would erode their graves. But in that battered valley, for one single day, freedom had stood its ground, and Samuel Carter would never let it die.